Hi everybody, and welcome to our section on preschool language development. Today we're going to take a look at the characteristics of preschool language development, and then, sneaky professor that I am, I'm going to work in a discussion of a contextual theory that we really didn't have time to talk about in the first unit of our class, where we talked about theories. And the theory that we're going to talk about is so language-based that it really, in many ways, is appropriate to discuss as we talk about language development. Let's just refresh our memory about language development. Remember, we talked about 5 types of linguistic study, if you will, 5 areas of linguistics. And we see different patterns of language development in these 5 areas. We talked about phonology, or the sound system of the language. We talked about morphology, or the mastering of small units of meaning, such as realizing in English that adding S for many words makes a plural. We talked about semantics, which is basically the vocabulary. We talked about syntax, which is, for our purposes, basically grammar, and is very closely tied to morphology. Although, especially in English, there's more to grammar than just morphology. We need to consider word order and things like that. And then we talked about pragmatics, which is a more social aspect of language, using language appropriately in different social contexts. All right, and we argued that throughout infancy, throughout the first couple of years of life, really kids are working on phonology and semantics. All right, so moving on to our discussion of language development in ages about 2 through 6, we see the continued development of semantics, of vocabulary. In fact, I'm going to have you watch a video at the end of this slide, and they'll talk about the idea of the language explosion, which starts usually around age 2 and continues for a couple of years, where kids just seem to be mastering, dozens of new words a day practically. But that is a continuation. That's kind of a continuous element from infancy into the preschool period. And I want to focus more on some of the newer things, the things that haven't been added yet into a child's repertoire as we talk about language development in these early years. Okay, so basically what we see is, of the 3 areas of linguistics that we didn't really talk about in the infancy, right? So morphology, syntax, and pragmatics, those start to develop during the preschool period. So we do see the development of syntax, or the development of grammatically correct speech, although just like with the use of individual words, as a child masters grammar, they often make some fairly predictable mistakes early on. And the most common mistake we hear is what we might call an overregularization error. Once a child masters a grammatical rule, such as add S to make a plural, okay, and they're mastering that at kind of a subconscious level, right? I mean, no child is going to, at age 3, say, I figured it out. I've got the rule for making plurals. They just kind of understand it, kind of subliminally, if you will. But once they master it on that unconscious level, often they'll go around applying that rule to everything, even to words that are exceptions. So instead of them saying mice, you'll hear them say mouses. Now, of course, they haven't heard mouses. Parents don't say mouses. Older siblings probably don't say mouses. But they have mastered the rule, and so they just over-regularize or overextend that rule. And it makes for some pretty charming speech sometime. And we'll see some examples of that in our video in just a couple of minutes. All right, so syntax, and with it morphology, is one real focus of language development in the preschool period. Another focus is pragmatics. Children start to be able to to use language more appropriately given the social context that they're in. So they'll start to, address their preschool teacher, in a more respectful tone, using their pleases and thank yous, probably being a bit more correct in their language usage, whereas with their friends, they might be more informal. That is evidence of developing pragmatics. And probably, at least in part, This is due to advancing social cognition. Okay, social cognition is thought about social relationships, thought about people. And we argued in our lecture on cognitive development that really, especially once kids get to kind of the middle of the preschool period, um, they're starting to understand much better uh, how other people think, what other people expect, and what other people want, rather than simply assuming that their own wants and thoughts are what everybody else experiences. So as they're able to kind of distinguish between their own mental world and other people's mental world, the pragmatics of their speech become more appropriate. Okay, and then finally, one type of speech that is characteristic of preschoolers, although I think if we're honest, it never really completely disappears, is what we call private speech. And you'll see there in parentheses, I've called it egocentric speech as well. Egocentric speech was Piaget's original term for it, but a guy named Vygotsky, who we're going to talk about in just a moment in some detail, came along and referred to it as private speech, and we tend to use Vygotsky's terminology these days. Private speech is when you talk out loud to yourself. You're not using speech in a social fashion, all right, which is why Piaget had called it egocentric. You're using it for yourself, right? And it might be most simple to think about examples where we still do this. I'm going to give you an example from my life. I know when I am first driving to a place, maybe I've never been there, a new restaurant or a new friend's house, even though I've got the directions, either being shouted to me by Siri or maybe written down, I often will still talk out loud to myself, especially if I'm the only person in the car, right? Okay, so I just passed Smith Street and I remember after Smith Street I've got to turn right on the next street. So there's the next street, okay, I'm turning right here, and that monologue will be happening out loud in my car as I'm driving. And you can probably think of examples from your own life where you're likely to talk out loud to yourself. Maybe you're, working on your math homework and trying to solve a problem or something like that. Well, we see this kind of monologue type speech most often in children from about 3 to 8 or so years of age. That goes a bit beyond the preschool period, but not much beyond the preschool period. So, if you were to chart the frequency of private speech, it would peak in that late preschool, early childhood time of life. It never really goes away completely, but we would do it on average as adults less often than a child who's like 5 years old. Okay, so you have a little video clip here to watch of a young girl engaging in kind of private speech. It's not truly private because clearly there's somebody across the table from her videotaping her, so she may well be talking to that person. But I think you can imagine if this little girl was coloring in her room without anybody around, you might still hear her talking the same way to herself. And so I would ask you to notice in the video that in many ways she's narrating what she's doing. And that's basically what my example was in my car, right? I was kind of problem solving / narrating what I was doing. And that seems to be what private speech is doing, is helping us kind of solve a problem or talk through a process that we're still trying to work out in our minds. We see private speech both among children and adults increasing when we put them in situations where they have to negotiate or navigate a process for the first time. All right, so you'll see this little girl, kind of narrating her experience of coloring. And when you're done with that, there's a more general video clip to watch on preschoolers' language development. And as you watch that video clip, they'll talk about the language explosion, and then there's also in the central portion of the clip a few examples of overregularization, where children are using grammatically incorrect sentences, although they are relying on correct grammar rules. They're just applying them incorrectly. So take a look at that as well. All right, moving on from general preschool language development, I want to take a bit of a detour and talk about a theory that we didn't have time to talk about in our first unit that is very heavily language-based. has implications also for language development, but also implications for children's development in general. And that is the theory of Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky, let me just give you kind of a bit of a background on him. He was a Russian scholar, a Russian psychologist, and did most of his work around the turn of the last century. And he died really young, so I mean, he really only had maybe a decade or decade and a half of actual hardcore work, shall we say. And he did most of his work in the area of cognitive development, educational psychology. And his ideas have been really hot here in the West over the last couple of decades. And you might wonder why the big gap. I mean, this guy died like in the 1930s, and it's really only maybe in the 80s and beyond that his ideas start to just explode in terms of child development and educational psychology. Why the gap there? Well, let's talk a little bit about the historical context. If you remember your modern, European history, which hopefully you've, studied in high school, if not here at Olivet, you probably remember that in the 19-teens, 1917 to be exact, there was a communist revolution in Russia, and really the wall went up between Russia and the West. And although we fought together in World War I and World War II, there wasn't a lot of cultural exchange, and in fact things were often quite hostile between the West and Russia. And so, Vygotsky's ideas really didn't seep into the West, if you will, until technology and improving political situations started to settle in kind of the late 70s, early 80s. And so it was really only then that we started to learn about his ideas and actually found them to be pretty awesome. Vygotsky, he's one of those people like Bronfenbrenner that I'm just kind of like in awe of, to be honest. And by the way, remember that Bronfenbrenner was Russian. He immigrated from Russia probably right about the time Vygotsky was doing his work. Bronfenbrenner immigrated as a child. He lived much longer than Vygotsky. But they're both Russian, and they're both kind of contextual in the way they approach things, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, so Vygotsky has this contextually based theory. In other words, there's going to be a heavy emphasis on culture. And his theory emphasizes the importance of language. It helps describe how language develops, but it also emphasizes the continuing role of language in a child's development. So it's kind of a dual purpose theory when it comes to language. So let's explore some of his ideas. All right, you see his basic ideas there. These are two of his basic ideas. There are many others, but I'm focusing more on the language issue in his theory at this point. One of his basic ideas is that language is a cultural tool. In fact, one of the primary cultural tools that we use to help children develop. Okay, so language is culturally based. I mean, what language you learn depends on what culture you're in or what subculture you're in, and it becomes one of the primary ways that children's development is promoted. And from that, you can probably ascertain, right, or understand that development is heavily relationship-based in Vygotsky's model. So proficiency in using language as a tool, okay, requires that we are interacting with other people, and ideally interacting not only with our age mates, but with people who are older than us and a little bit further along the developmental path than we are. Okay, in particular adults and older children. All right, so we're going to take a look at some of Vygotsky's ideas about how language develops and how it becomes a tool that promotes further development in children. And we'll also, near the end here, see a video that shows a practical application of these ideas in the preschool classroom. Okay, so of all the richness in Vygotsky's theory, there's two major concepts that I'd like you to know. And by the way, let me say that I don't think I've said this yet, um, that Vygotsky is covered in your textbook briefly, but he's not covered in this particular chapter. So if you want to, kind of get another take on the definition of these concepts or just have a different perspective on them, I believe he's discussed briefly in the first chapter and then also in the chapter on infant cognitive development. You can look up his name or the name of these concepts in the index and find where they're talked about. That being said, I'm not going to test you on the sections about him in the textbook. If you listen to this lecture and feel like you understand everything that's been said and know these concepts, their definitions, from what I say here, you will be fine for the items on Vygotsky on the next test. This is not my tricky way of getting you to go back and study stuff that you've already been held accountable for. All right, so the two concepts I'd like you to know are the ones you see in front of you. And we're going to talk not only about what they mean, but also in proposing these ideas, how Vygotsky differs from Piaget, because they're really the two major names, in cognitive development, at least historically. And Piaget really dominated in the West up until about the time that Vygotsky started to break through, or Vygotsky's ideas started to break through to the West. In fact, kind of a weird historical coincidence now that I think about it, Piaget died actually right around the time that the Iron Curtain or the Cold War between Russia and the West started to kind of break apart, leaving kind of this, I don't know, people waiting for kind of a new era, if you will, in cognitive development, and Vygotsky really in many ways provided that. Anyway, let's take a look at his two key concepts here. Unfortunately, the language is translated from Russian, and so sometimes it gets a bit awkward. As you probably know, sometimes translating things, you can't really do it word for word in a way that makes total sense. Anyway, the first concept here is the zone of proximal development, or what we call the ZPD. This is very simply, despite the weird name, the difference between what a child can do on his or her own and what he or she can do with help. Help from somebody else who knows better, who knows a skill better, who is a little bit more advanced, more mature. And this is, again, despite the weird, awkward name, it's really quite a simple concept. Take something like, swinging a bat. You can give a kid a bat and a ball, and they can go out and practice on their own, and eventually, maybe weeks down the line, they'll kind of figure out how to swing the bat in a way that's useful. Or you can go out there with them and, model, hello, Albert Bandura, right? Model a swing for them, then, give them the bat, have them try. Maybe you kind of stand behind them and put your arms around them and help them hold the bat. Then you back off a little bit and maybe within a day or two, you'll have them swinging relatively well. Okay, so the difference between those two situations is what Vygotsky calls the zone of proximal development. Again, a fairly simple concept, but very, very different than what Piaget would recommend in terms of letting kids, in terms of educating kids or teaching kids a skill, right? He would say, Piaget would say, the best kind of learning comes from letting kids just explore on their own, and put together the process on their own, right? That kind of exploration-based learning is what creates the deepest knowledge. Well, there may be some truth to that. If a kid figures something out on their own, they're maybe more likely to, have a deeper understanding of things. But it's also pretty inefficient. Kids may take much, much longer to learn something. And so Vygotsky is saying basically, forget your individualistic ways, if you will. It's not about one individual person going out and putting together a whole process from beginning to end. It's actually about getting a child in a relationship and, using that cultural tool of language to help them learn a skill. Okay? And the assistance that the adult provides in the batting example, modeling first and then maybe standing behind the kid and, helping you know, put their hands on the bat in the correct way. That help or that assistance is called scaffolding. Okay, that is the assistance provided by adults or older children that allow the child to move through the zone of proximal development. Okay, now as we've mentioned, Vygotsky's theory is very language-based in a couple of ways. First of all, it sees language as this cultural tool that can help a child, for example, learn how to swing a bat, or learn how to do math, right? Or learn how to figure out how to deal with peer-related problems. What do you do when you're bullied and things like that. It is also something that we learn through these processes of scaffolding. So the examples in language development that I've given here at the bottom of the slide are examples of scaffolding that we as adults use with children to help promote their language development in particular. Okay, to help them climb through the zone of proximal development in learning language. Okay, not in learning how to swing a bat, but in learning language itself. And there's two things, actually more than two, but here's two examples of things that research has shown adults often do naturally as they're interacting with younger children. And we know that there are at least correlations between these two things and quicker language development. So these two things can't necessarily assume that a correlation is a causative factor, but these two things may well help children develop linguistically. What are these two things? Well, one is recasting. Recasting involves taking what a child has said incorrectly and restating it in a correct fashion. Okay, taking what a child has said incorrectly and restating it in a correct fashion. So, for example, we've talked about overregularization errors, right, in preschoolers. You might have your son or daughter come home and the child might say to you, you know, Daddy, we wented to the store, right? Which is incorrect, perfectly understandable, but incorrect. And if you are recasting, as a matter of conversation, you might naturally say, oh, you went to the store. How interesting, or you seem to enjoy that, right? So you're restating what the child has said in a correct fashion, and thereby modeling the correct use of the past tense in that case. That's what we call recasting. Now note, it's very informal. It's on the part of parents and teachers, you know, fairly probably even subconscious. It's not like you're sitting the kid down and giving them a grammar lesson. Now look, honey, you know, we don't say wented. Went is a perfectly acceptable past tense. It's not like that. It's a very natural way of engaging a child linguistically, language-relatedly, in conversation, and yet correcting their mistakes. And so when parents use recasting, often children overcome their errors more quickly. Another example of scaffolding is expansion. Expansion is when a child is speaking about something and you encourage them to expand on it. Okay, so you might have a child who comes home and whether or not they say it correctly, they might say, Daddy, we went to the store, we gone to the store. And you might say, oh, you went to the store, right? That's recasting. Expansion is when you provide a little bit more detail and ask the child about it. You went to the store. Yes, Mommy said you were going to Kohl's today. I wonder what you saw there. Tell me about what you saw, right? So that expansion allows the child linguistically to add more detail and thereby provides more practice for their language development. Okay, so another thing that parents do, you know, again, kind of only semi-consciously, that helps promote the language development of the child. Let's take a look at a visual representation of these two concepts, and then we'll move on to a video that will demonstrate them in practice. These two concepts, by the way, being the zone of proximal development and scaffolding. All right, I just wanted to show you this figure simply because it gives a visual representation of the two Vygotskian concepts that we talked about, which sometimes can make it a little bit easier to understand. So let's take a look and kind of unpack what's going on here. Our two basic axes, right, the x-axis and the y-axis, or the horizontal axis and the vertical axis are time, right? So a child's life, if you will, weeks in, weeks out, on the horizontal axis. And then on the vertical axis, we have their level of maturity. And that really can be in anything. It certainly can be in language development, right? Are they still speaking, for example, with grammatical errors? That might be a lower level of maturity. Or have they mastered grammatical forms? That might be a higher level of maturity. It could be in swinging a bat, right? If they can't even hold the bat level, that's a low level of maturity. If they're swinging in a way that connects with the ball most every time, that's a high level of maturity. All right, and the two lines that are drawn there in between the axes represent potential trajectories or pathways of development. And you'll see that the lower line shows some development, right? A child is getting a little bit more mature and a little bit more mature over time, um, but the slope is not nearly as steep as the upper line. A child masters mature behavior much more quickly with the trajectory of the upper line. And notice that the difference is whether or not a child is being helped or mentored, or shown what to do. And of course, that help and mentoring and modeling on the part of uh, an older child or an adult in all likelihood implies some kind of language usage. The difference between those two lines is the zone of proximal development, right? It's how much more development we can expect if a child is, interacting with dad at the end of the day and having those conversations that spur on language development, or if the child has an older sibling that's willing to go out and show them how to swing a bat. All right, so Vygotsky's model is a very interpersonal and very interactive model of development, which is a little bit different than Piaget's approach. Piaget's approach, like I said, is very kind of hands-off on the part of teachers and parents. And so what I'd like you to do now is go to the video that's going to end this particular lesson. And this is a video on applying Vygotsky's ideas in the preschool classroom. And I want you to notice how actively involved the preschool teachers are. They're asking questions of the kids as they're playing. They're providing new vocabulary for the kids as they're playing. They're challenging problem solving in the kids as they're playing. This is a very Vygotskian-based preschool classroom. If you were in a Piagetian-based preschool classroom, the adults would hang back, not get nearly as involved, because the idea in a Piagetian approach is much more let the kids explore on their own and figure it out themselves. Again, not necessarily a bad way to go about things, but in terms of development and learning, it can be a very inefficient way to go about things. It can take kids an awfully long time to figure things out on their own. Sometimes we have that time and sometimes we don't. Let me also add that, as Vygotsky has been applied in the classroom, we found that these interactive models, these mentoring models that have come from Vygotsky's ideas have really promoted higher levels of achievement than other models. Vygotsky has been used a lot in reading instruction, in other areas of instruction, and it seems to again promote achievement and development in a much more efficient way than some of the other models that are out there. So again, as you watch this video, just notice how interactive the teachers are. See if you can find some examples of recasting and expansion, but in any case, notice just how involved the teachers are. That's a very Vygotskian way to do education. It would be a very Vygotskian way to do parenting.